In this lecture, we will go over the CFA Level 2 reading on Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. This is a short but very interesting reading and has been taken from the Harvard Business Review. The first major point made in this reading is that your strategy should be developed in the context of the industry where you operate. As an example, if you are developing a strategy for a company in the oil industry, clearly you will have to think very differently from a situation where you are developing a strategy for an internet software company such as Facebook. And that is what this reading helps us understand, because one of the issues is that many strategists try to use the same tools across different industries, and that does not work. When developing a strategy, we need to consider the following critical factors: predictability and malleability. Predictability refers to how far into the future and how accurately can you confidently forecast demand, corporate performance, competitive dynamics, and market expectations. As you can see from my simple examples up here, the predictability of the oil industry is definitely higher than the predictability of the internet software industry. The other factor is malleability. This refers to the extent to which your competitors or you influence these factors. Malleability refers to the extent to which you or your competitors influence these factors such as demand, competitive dynamics, and market expectations. On this slide, I have simply reproduced an excerpt from the curriculum which I believe summarizes the main points extremely well. I will read this out with you and then have you do a small exercise. Companies that correctly match their strategy making process to their competitive circumstances perform better than those that don't. So the point here is that if you are an oil industry strategist, you need to understand the dynamics of your industry before making the strategy. But too many use approaches appropriate only to predictable environments, even in highly volatile situations. What executives in these cases need is a strategy for setting strategy. The authors of this reading present a framework for choosing one, which begins with two questions. How unpredictable is your environment? So this is the predictability dimension. And how much power do you or others have to change that environment? The answers give rise to four broad strategic styles, each one particularly suited to a distinct environment. And here are the four different styles. A classical strategy works well for companies operating in predictable and immutable environments. Immutable environments would be environments where the malleability is low. In other words, you and your competitors cannot influence the competitive environment too much. The second strategy is a shaping strategy. This is best in unpredictable environments that you have the power to change. The third strategy is an adaptive strategy. This is more flexible and experimental and works far better in immutable environments that are unpredictable. And finally, a visionary strategy, which can also be called build it and they will come. This strategy is appropriate in predictable environments that you have the power to change. If you are paying attention, you will probably realize that these 4 strategies are being classified along a predictability dimension and a malleability dimension. If this is high malleability, this is low malleability, and in terms of predictability, let's say this is high predictability and this is low, then what I want you to do is put each of these strategies in the appropriate quadrant. Here is what you should come up with. Low malleability, which is the same as saying immutable, and high predictability, this would be the classical strategy. Shaping strategy, best in unpredictable environments. So that means predictability is low, so we will be in the top half. That you have the power to change. Power to change means that malleability is high. So the shaping strategy would be over here. An adaptive strategy is more flexible and experimental and works far better in immutable environments that are unpredictable. So immutable would mean the left half, and unpredictable would mean the top left segment. So this would be our adaptive strategy. And finally, bottom right would be visionary. A visionary strategy is appropriate in predictable environments that you have the power to change. So here we have the visionary strategy. Now let's take each of these strategies and dive into a little more detail. We will first talk about the classical strategy, and this is typically the strategy that you learn about in business school, and most company executives are therefore familiar with this strategy. The oil industry is a classic industry. The oil industry is a good example of an industry where this particular strategy will work. There is a reasonable amount of predictability, not in the sense that you know exactly what is going to happen, but you at least know what are the factors that impact demand, and you know what are the factors which impact supply. So it is reasonably predictable. It is not malleable in the sense that even a large player like ExxonMobil will not be able to fundamentally alter the industry. With this strategy or this style, it makes sense to have some sort of a strategic planning unit. So a company like ExxonMobil could have a strategy unit or a strategy division that sets the goals and then tries to achieve those goals in the most favorable manner. In other words, companies try to position themselves in order to maximize shareholder value. And this will be done in the context of capabilities and resources. This should look very familiar because, as I mentioned, most people or most executives study the classical strategy. Next, we look at the adaptive strategy. And an example of where this would be used is the specialty fashion retailing industry. The curriculum gives an example of a Spanish company called Zara, or I'm not sure exactly how this would be pronounced, but that is how it is written. Now, in this industry, trends change very fast. So if a company makes a long-term strategy, chances are that very quickly that strategy will be obsolete. So here it doesn't make sense to have a strategic planning unit that is completely separate from the business units. In fact, the strategy or the planning function needs to be very close to each individual business unit, and the strategy needs to be constantly refined. The tactics have to adjust to the circumstances, and the tactics need to and the company strategy should be such, and the company should be able to shift, acquire or divest resources smoothly and promptly. So when we go back to this example, if a given style looks like it will take off but it does not, then it should be easy for the company to change gears or change direction and go after another style. The shaping strategy works well in new industries with low barriers to entry where the level of innovation is high. A classic example would be the internet software industry. This strategy also works in highly fragmented, mature industries where companies can potentially redefine the industry. As you can imagine, the planning cycle needs to be very short. In fact, it has to be to some extent continuous because the environment can change extremely fast. Another point associated with this strategy is that the focus needs to be beyond the company's own boundaries. If we take the example of Facebook, Facebook developed strong relationships with application developers and opened up its platform to application developers all over the world, and that is a strategy which allowed Facebook to do extremely well. The details are given in the curriculum, but the main point is that a company can't just be focused within its own boundaries. And finally, the visionary strategy. Examples of this would be Thomas Edison and the electricity industry, or Ratan Tata in the automotive industry with the introduction of the nano automobile. This is Ratan Tata's vision that there is a market for an ultra cheap automobile. This idea has not been implemented before, so in a sense we have a visionary who is defining a new segment within the automotive industry and then pursuing that vision. The implication here is that the business environment can be molded. What the visionary does is defines the goal and then moves towards that goal. And clearly, as with the classical strategy, long-term strategic planning does make sense over here. In fact, it would not be possible to achieve objectives without a long-term plan in place. A short section in which the authors talk about a survey that they did. The authors spoke to several executives and asked them about the strategy that they use. And it turns out that most executives did realize that they need to use a different strategy depending on the circumstances. But it turned out that most executives either used the classic strategy or the visionary strategy. In other words, they used strategies which involve a high degree of predictability. The other two strategies that recognize the fact that their industry is not particularly predictable, those strategies were not employed. Now, in terms of misplaced confidence, it also turned out that most executives overestimated predictability. In other words, they thought that their industry was more predictable than it actually was. Also, they overestimated malleability. Again, in other words, they overestimated their ability to influence the industry. So the trap to avoid then is, if you are an executive defining a strategy, you need to be more careful about recognizing how predictable your industry really is. And if it is not predictable, you should recognize that. Also understand your limitations in terms of your ability to control or influence the industry in which you operate. Next, unexamined habits. The main point here is that most companies would do annual planning. Even industries where the business environment changes very fast would have this annual planning exercise where the executives would get together and spend a lot of time creating forecasts for the upcoming year. In an environment which changes very fast or an environment which is not very predictable, those annual forecasts can be obsolete within a matter of weeks. So it would make a lot more sense to recognize how much predictability we have in our industry, and then the planning cycle needs to be adjusted accordingly. If the predictability is high, then the frequency of the planning exercises needs to be much more, and the degree of detail that we get into obviously needs to be less if the predictability is high. The next point relates to cultural mismatches. A given organization might be stuck in this quadrant where the culture is such that the company defines long-term goals. Let's say that the long-term goal is to increase profitability by cutting costs. But let's say that the company really needs to be in this more adaptive quadrant. It is important for the executives to understand that fact and then make adjustments so that they move into the appropriate quadrant and then use the proper strategy which makes most sense for their environment. And one way of doing this is to be more careful about evaluating how good your predictive abilities are. If somebody is in this classical environment and is making predictions, but then tests how accurate those predictions are, by looking at your results, you might be able to figure out that this is not the right place for you to be and you really need to move to a more adaptive strategy. I will actually read out the last statement in this section, which I think is very useful, and that statement is as follows. To get a better sense of the extent to which industry players can change their environment, we recommend, and this is the authors recommend, measuring industry youthfulness, concentration, growth rate, innovation rate, and rate of technology change, all of which increase malleability. So these factors indicate where on this particular matrix a company should be. And again, I will repeat those factors. Industry youthfulness. Obviously, if that is high, youthfulness means if the industry is young, then the malleability is more. Concentration, growth rate, innovation rate, and rate of technology change, all these factors impact the malleability of the industry. Operating in many modes. Determining your company's position on the predictability, malleability matrix is important, but that is not enough. A company will have different business units, and at times a business unit within a company might have a different position on the matrix. So each business unit also needs to ask the following questions. How predictable is the environment in which our unit operates? And how much power do we have to change the environment? Also, various functions in an organization might require different approaches towards strategy and planning. If you consider the automotive industry, clearly the strategy used by the production department will need to be different from the strategy used by the digital marketing department. So notice these are two different functions, and how they approach strategy and their planning cycles will clearly be different. And the final point here is that a company moving into a different stage of its life cycle may require a shift in strategic style. And I alluded to this on the previous slide. If you have a young company in a young industry, there the malleability will be high. But as the company matures and the industry matures, then the malleability might become less. So the position on the matrix will change. This is the final slide. For this particular reading, the curriculum hasn't given us any practice problems. So I've just listed a few questions that you should be able to answer. The first one is, how should an analyst evaluate the predictability and malleability of an industry? This is clearly important. You as an analyst need to determine whether the company executives are using the appropriate strategy. And as we've discussed, the appropriate strategy is based on the malleability and predictability of the industry. We've talked about the factors which influence malleability. This would include the size or the age of the company and the industry, the rate of technical innovation, and so on. For predictability, you can take a look at how clearly we can define the factors which influence a particular industry. You need to be able to create the predictability, malleability matrix and identify the appropriate strategy for each quadrant. So I've done this a few times and you need to be able to do this very fast. We have malleability on the horizontal axis where we say high malleability on the right, low on the left. And then we have predictability on the vertical axis where we say high predictability over here, low predictability over here. This would be the classical strategy. This would be the adaptive strategy, the visionary strategy. And the shaping strategy. It would be useful if you can identify at least 2 industries for each quadrant. We've talked about the oil and gas industry over here. We've talked about the internet software industry over here. This would be Ratan Tata in the automotive industry, for example. Adaptive would be specialty, fashion, retail industry, and so on. There is actually a very nice exhibit in the curriculum which has been taken from a Boston Consulting Group analysis which lists several industries in each quadrant, and I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that exhibit. That is it for this reading.